Okay, so thank you all for joining us today for the Genocide and Human Rights Fall Webinar Series. My name is Megan Reed and I'm the Operations Coordinator for the Zorian Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This series was created in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted the Institute's annual Genocide and Human Rights University program. After our first series this past summer, we found that there was a great response from participants who wanted to learn more about the different cases and theories of genocide and human rights studies. So we're back with the fall session. My colleague Jenna will be posting more information about the Institute's Genocide and Human Rights University program and how to get involved in the chat box, so look out for that. And a few housekeeping items before we begin. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. The Q&A period will be about 20 to 30 minutes long, and it would allow you the opportunity to also explore some of the discussion questions as well, which will be shared in the chat box. So without further ado, we'd like to introduce the session titled Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, A Case for Genocide with Professor Flávio de Leão Bastos Pereira. Professor Pereira has a PhD in political and economic law and is completing his postdoc at the Reggio Calabria University in Italy. He is a member of the roster of experts of International Nuremberg Principles Academy. He is a 2014 graduate of the Institute's Genocide and Human Rights University program hosted at the University of Toronto and has gone on to continue his research in the field. He is also a member of the International Network of Genocide Scholars. Professor Pereira, welcome. We're so happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Megan and Gina. I'm very happy to join you again. And anyway, to be at Zorian again. I'm really happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today. We're so happy to have you back as well.
Thank you. And to all our colleagues and researchers that are with us in this afternoon. Well, may I start?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will share my slides. Well, I'm going to talk about the situation of the indigenous Brazilian nations, the hard situation they are going through. But I will try to give to you an overview on our history, our indigenous nations history. Well, I think you can see my slides, right? I will send to you after the presentation to share with our colleagues here. And anyway, I would like to outline the main topics of my presentation. Well, first of all, I must talk about a general information about Brazil, about its indigenous nations, and why we live nowadays under a very hard situation. But not only why we have now a government declared anti-indigenous, but also because we have a history of persecution in Brazil. So my first topic is the general information about Brazil and its indigenous nations. My second topic tells about persecution and extermination along our history, the colonization period, the military dictatorship, which effects we feel still today, because in Brazil, our transitional justice was not completed as, for example, in Argentina. Then I'll talk about our redemocratization period and about Bolsonaro government. And finally, I will share with you some reflections about the legal concept of genocide. I don't know if my dear friend, the judge of the International Criminal Court, the Brazilian judge, Silvestein, is with us. And she's a very close friend of mine and an inspiration about these studies. And I'll try to give to you the view of the legal concept of genocide and why I understand in relation to the indigenous nations, it's not enough. Well, general information. Brazil is a very large country, a very beautiful country with a very friendly people, around 211 million people. Our territory is very large too. We have a very extensive frontier. more than 8 million kilometers. Our idiom is Portuguese because we were colonized by Portugal. If for you to have a brief view about our indigenous nations, when the Portuguese got to Brazil, we do not have a very exactly concordance about the number, but the researchers established a number between 4 million and 6 million indigenous individuals in Brazil. We can, for example, make a comparison now. Portugal population that time was no more than 1,200,000 inhabitants. So the indigenous in the Americas that time, from Canada to Argentina and Chile, were around 8 million individuals. Nowadays, in Brazil, we have no more than 896,000 individuals. So that's a question, right? I have an opinion that the quantity is not enough to give us an idea of the brutality of a regime. We cannot compare one dictatorship with another dictatorship, because the quantity is not a criteria, a safe criteria to understand the brutality. But we lost in Brazil around 4 or 5 million indigenous individuals. In Latin America, it's very important to inform our colleagues from the North Hemisphere, from Asia. I know we have many friends here from Armenia, our dear Armenia, from Asia, from other continents. It's very important to inform that Latin America is an indigenous continent. And still today, even after an historical genocide, we can verify the indigenous population, for example, in Mexico, 15%, in Nicaragua, 80%, in Guatemala. We had a wonderful lecture about Guatemala genocide at Soria. In Brazil, they are no more than 0.4 or 5%. In Brazil, we do not have the largest indigenous population, but we have the largest number of different indigenous nations. We have here in Brazil around 305 different ethnic groups with different languages, with different religions, with different way of life, clothes, etc. And now, and also we, and this data I'm telling you about is from 10 years ago when we had our last census. We have now, according to the government, 274 different languages. These different languages, they are a kind of, they are developed from 3 main languages: the language G, the language Macro-G, and the language Tupi. From these 3 languages, we had developed all these 274. And this indigenous population occupies around 12% of the Brazilian territory. Here, I must tell you that our government, Bolsonaro's government, and all that political view, that anti-indigenous, used to say that we had a lot of lands for small Indians. They are traditional lands. But I could tell you that we have around 500,000 indigenous living in these lands, in these 12% of the lands, of the Brazilian lands. But we have around 97,000 farmers occupying more than 20% of the Brazilian territory. If you take a look at Brazilian territory, more than 8 million kilometers, you can have an idea how few families occupy large percentage of our territory? Well, please, if you have any doubts, Megan, you can tell me, okay? Another important information, besides these 896,000 individuals, and besides these 305 different nations, we also have around 100 uncontacted tribes, uncontacted groups that have never kept contact with the dominant society. When I studied Zorian, I reflected a lot the idea of civilization with Professor Christopher Power, that was our professor at Zorian. And then I tried to avoid using this term for our dominant society. I really have doubts if we are civilized, and I'll tell you why. So we have these indigenous Brazilian groups that never have any contact with this industrialized capitalist society. You can see at the map 3 red points in the world when we still have uncontacted tribes: Asia, Oceania, and the Amazon, the South American Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, the Amazon in Venezuela and Peru, for example. These 100 groups are most of them inside the Brazilian Amazon. Why in the Brazilian Amazon? Because they are fleeing from the contact. They know by their oral tradition that any direct contact means death by disease or by direct extermination. Yes, when some farmers, for example, cattle breeders and other interested in the land richness, they discover these groups, the extermination is almost immediately. And so they run to the forest, they try to flee to avoid the contact. You can see these dramatic images in the Brazilian Amazon, when a group, we call them Maitá Nation, the Maitas, they are frightened with the airplane that took these photographs. You can realize it in their faces. Other images, we don't know nothing about their paintings, their graphisms, their way of life, as I had told you. This is another interesting image because they are from a non-nation, the Yanomamis. Yanomamis are very famous nations in the world, even outside Brazil. But we need to understand their social framework. We have different locations, Yanomami locations. As we live in different cities, they do it also. But this location, specifically this location, is isolated. They isolate themselves from the contact. To show you, I'd like to show you now a 2-minute video about this context. It shows, it's a BBC production that shows a Brazilian anthropologist recording these uncontacted tribes to prove that they exist. Because the Peru government and other governments, they used to say they do not exist. Why? Because it's easier to colonize and to increase the pressure over the forests. So it's a 2-minute video. Please, you can realize the beauty of the nation.
Jose Carlos Morelos is on his way to the remote headwaters of the Indira River in Brazil. The dense Amazon forests below are home to one of the last uncontacted tribes left on Earth. Morelos works for Brazil's Indian Affairs Department, and his job is to monitor the tribe's lands for signs of invaders.
Primeiro que são povos meio que desconhecidos, né? É difícil convencer até o próprio Estado, né, que eles existem.
But the pressures on these forests are growing, and Morelos knows that he has to convince those who doubt the tribes live here at all. For the first time, he's allowed a BBC film crew to travel with him. Powerful zoom lenses will allow them to film from a kilometer away and minimize disturbance.
E não acreditando que eles existem, não vai ter nenhum movimento a favor deles. E uma imagem, às vezes, vale por 1000 relatórios, por 1000 palavras. Está aqui.
Their gardens are full of manioc, their main food. They're also growing bananas and papaya. And there are hundreds of anato trees. The tribe makes bright red body paint from the crushed seeds. Morelos has been monitoring this tribe for 20 years, but he fears their lives are about to change for the worse. Illegal logging across the border in Peru is forcing uncontacted tribes there to flee.
Que de repente começou a aparecer uns isolados lá que não eram de lá. É óbvio, qual é o único lugar para onde esses isolados podem correr? É para o lado de cá, não tem para onde mais correr.
But instead of expelling the loggers, Peru's government has suggested that uncontacted tribes don't exist at all.
É a única maneira da gente poder mostrar ao resto da humanidade que esses povos existem. É melhor isso do que ele entrar em contato com um bando de garimpeiro ou com um madeireiro, que vão matá-los na primeira vez que virem, não vão fotografar, vão atirar neles e matar.
And it's not just violence that puts uncontacted people at risk. Viruses, like the common cold, can kill them, and even wipe the tribes out completely.
A minha utopia seria que esses povos tivessem primeiro a opção de escolha, né? Nós vamos continuar, nós vamos entrar em contato. É a terra, você conseguir o espaço e manter esse espaço livre de interferência, de qualquer interferência, que é a única forma dos índios isolados sobreviverem. Não tem outra forma.
Okay, so we can realize the importance of the preservation of the traditional land. The main point, if you want to talk about physical existence, if you want to talk about cultural existence, if you want to talk about health during the COVID pandemic in the world, any kind of fundamental and human right, first of all, in relation to the indigenous nations all over the world, the land is the main topic. And this is what is at risk in Brazil nowadays. So I would like to say too that this contact, as you have seen the image, it's kept only by airplane. There's a principle in Brazil established by the anthropologists since 1985, the non-direct contact principle. We cannot be at direct contact with these groups because of the risks that they are submitted to. So after this general view, I must tell you a little about how persecution, extermination, and racism until today has the indigenous nations and the Black population in Brazil as a target. Many think outside Brazil, think that Brazil is a racial democracy. No, Brazil is a racist country. We have what we call a kind of structural racism. We have Professor Silvio Almeida in Brazil that now is at Duke University in US, Adilson Moreira, Jamila Ribeiro, and other thinkers that deals with this issue. The first law I could tell you, the religious law, was written by the Pope Nicholas V. It's the Romanus Pontifex Papal Bull that expressly in 1454 gave the permission, legitimated the invasions, the conquest, the submission, and the enslavement of the enemies of Christ. We are talking about that old civilizations in Brazil, the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They are here. We have proof about anthropological proofs and archaeological proofs about their presence in the Americas for more than 40,000 years. The second Papal Bull was written by Pope Alexander VI from the Borgias, if I'm not wrong. And he reiterated and reinforced the permission to steal the lands. I'm using here the exactly expression in the Papal Bull, to steal the lands, the island, to submit the inhabitants of the New World to reduce them to the Christian faith. This is a hot topic today in Brazil about the assimilation. But these were Papal Bulls from the Vatican. In Brazil, a Portuguese governor, Marquês of Pombal, wrote in 1757 an act which is named Pombal Directory or Indians Directory. He expelled the religious orders from Brazil, and then the idea was now the indigenous nations in Brazil will become Portuguese like us, submitted to the Portuguese king. And then this was a kind of assimilation, but the consequences were a disaster. Why? Because if I allow the access to the indigenous land, to the white people, to the Europeans, and to the new Brazilians that were born in Brazil, non-indigenous individuals, what did happen? They took the land, they violated the women. This is a kind of specific research, the drama of the indigenous women. And in Brazil nowadays, the indigenous women are the leaders of their rights movement, the women. And with this act, the consequence was that the land was stolen, the women were violated, and until today, in the big cities of Brazil, the poor districts are a legacy of these invasions to their communities. It was really a disaster. I could say to you that the first sense of citizenship that was offered to the indigenous was the assimilation. But assimilation is genocide. I'm not talking under the 1948 UN Convention. I'm talking about the Raphael Lemkin vision, and I will return to this point soon. So if you consider the year of the Brazil's independence, 1822, when it got to 1822, there were no more than 600,000 indigenous. They were 5 million, and 300 years later, they were no more than 600. It's a genocide. For sure, it's a genocide. We do not have doubts about that. But, and I would like also to establish an historical connection. When we study the Holocaust, when we study the Armenian genocide, when we study the Namas and Hereros genocide in Africa, in Namibia, between 1904 and 1907, we must consider the memory, historical memory of the indigenous reserves in the Americas, in US, in Canada, with the first people, and also in the Latin America. John Toland, a biographer of Adolf Hitler, in this book, it has a very interesting information. Hitler's concept of concentration camps, as well as the practicality of genocide, owed much, so he claimed, to his studies of English and United States history. Hitler admired the camps for Boer prisoners in South Africa and for the Indians in the Wild West, and often praised to his inner circle the efficiency of America's extermination by starvation and uneven combat of the Red Savages. Red Savage is a racialist expression, as Indian is a racialist expression. Indian, those, if you know, have a small knowledge of the Spanish language, India, no God, India, no God. It's a racialist expression. They're of the Red Savages who could not be tamed by captivity. What I want to tell is that all the dynamics and frameworks of the extermination of the indigenous in the Americas is also an historical experience, as the Armenian genocide was not, the world did not pay the adequate attention to the Armenian genocide. That's why we can achieve more and more systematically genocides in the world. But the indigenous was the first, if we consider the colonization. You have here the mention of the book for those who are interested. Now, I talk about the second phase of Brazil history in this context, our military dictatorship. In 1964, the military promoted a coup against the elected government of Brazil. What were the main aspects of this movement? Anti-communism, developmentalism, a kind of, I could say, I'm sorry, but I could say a kind of, let's make Brazil great again, something like that. Well, a development model based on expropriation of Indian resources by multinationals and large private corporations and by the state. There was a kind of conluio, a kind of a complicity between the government, the military government, and multinational interested in the indigenous lands. This is a book that you can find in Canada, in US, because it was written by Shelton Davis. Shelton Davis was an American indigenist that lived in Brazil between our indigenous peoples. And he wrote in 1973, during the dictatorship, this book, Victims of the Miracle. And this is a very important issue. I'll put you now a question. I put to you now a question. Is genocide restricted to death squads like the Einsatzgruppen in East Europe? Or can I promote genocide, suppressing the economical and fundamental basis for the existence of a group? This is a question that we are facing today with the destruction of the Amazon by the current government in Brazil. So we had repression, we have imprisonment, torture, rapes against the female political opponents, forced disappearances and murders of indigenous individuals. the indigenous nations in Brazil, they suffer with a kind of invisibility. Everybody talks about the missing people, political opponents that are missing until today due to the actions of the dictatorship. But after the report of our National Truth Commission, we had in Brazil a National Truth Commission, as we had in Canada, the Truth Commission for the schools for indigenous children. We had it here also. In this report, we could prove the murder of more than 8,000 indigenous individuals. This report is in Portuguese, but it's at your disposal at the internet. And during our dictatorship, we had, for sure, like Shelton Davis wrote, the dispossession of thousands of rural migrants from Brazilian Northeast, people from the countryside, poor people. That's why during our dictatorship, the large cities in Brazil became much more populated because people were starving in the countryside. And the regime was a kind of, they make it easier for the farmers to take lands. We had cases of indigenous nations that had their children kidnapped and took by Brazilian airplanes to the other side of the country because the parents would go behind them, and then the lands were ready to be colonized by farmers. This what I'm telling you now is all of these informations are documented. Deforestation of the Brazilian Amazon, it's an old problem in Brazil, especially during our dictatorship. What we are facing today is an old idea. We need to deforestate the Amazon to create monocultures. Farmers must do it. And our biosphere, our biomas are under risk, were under risk, and now with a captain, an old captain of the army as president, these ideas are back again. Our National Truth Commission has a declaration. We have a declaration in this report that I thought it was very clear to you. We had in Brazil a serious violations of human rights suffered by indigenous nations between 1946 and 1988. Flávio, Professor Flávio, why are you talking about 1946 if the Brazilian dictatorship started with a coup of state in 1964? Because the Brazilian indigenous nations had been victims of the successive Brazilian government, all of them, some better, some worse. And the report also informs us these violations are systemic as a result of the state structural policies. And then, in this point, I come back again to the concept of genocide. Well, it's not only the totalitarian model of state, a Nazi state, for example, that has the instruments to practice a genocide, but also the liberal democracies of the West. This is very important to consider here. And the report also says the state directly acted or was remained silent on such violations, because we have cases of direct murders by the state's workers against the indigenous in Brazil. But it also had cases. For example, the farmer used an airplane to bomb indigenous communities under the silence of the Brazilian government during our dictatorship. Such violation is not sporadic. They are not accidental. This is very important. I show you this case, the Cinta Larga nation, a very important nation, indigenous nation in the Amazon. This is known as the massacre of the Parallel 11, when some land miners, farmers used airplanes to bomb these communities, and after that, they distributed poisoned food and toys to the indigenous children. We have in Brazil, for example, another case. This nation was named Goitacazes. The Goitacazes was a nation that was totally destroyed. They do not exist anymore. In the 16th, 17th centuries, because they received poisoned clothes to wear. This is a kind of bacteriological war that was practiced in US, in Canada, in Australia, and also in Brazil. This is the region, you can see here, the region had this massacre happened. Another, just a figure, just an image for you to have an idea. The Umutimas was extincted too. This is a shaman, a religious leader of the Umutimas in 1957. They were totally exterminated by epidemics and by diseases. In a first historical moment, the Portuguese didn't know that a simple flu could exterminate all a nation. But after that, this was a bacteriological gun, a kind of gun used against indigenous. I could tell you also about the Krenak Nation Reformatory. We have a nation here, the Krenaks, in the state of Minas Gerais, a very old nation. They have more than 15,000 years of existence. They were reduced now to 400 people. And during our military dictatorship, a prison was built in the Krenak lands. And in this prison, we had murders, violations, sexual violences, beatings, starving indigenous, and indigenous that were brought from all the regions of Brazil to that land. Can you imagine? We are talking about 300 different nations. Imagine if we put Portuguese, Canadians, French, British in a concentration camp. That's why I see a kind of connection between what the happenings of the 20th century. When around 1961, two brothers, they are named three brothers, the Vilas Boas brothers. They were in an expedition, and they fall in love with the Indian nations. And after a long way, they created the Xingu National Park. Xingu is in the center of Brazil. You can see Brazil's map here. And in a little red sign here, you can see the Xingu Park. We have here today around 15 different nations. And this sacred land for us is now under extremely danger due to the great infrastructural constructions like for example, the Belo Monte Dam, the third largest dam in the world. You can see it here. In 1973, and this is a very important fact, we have the construction in Brazil of a binational dam. Binational because it was constructed by Brazil and Paraguay states. That time, they were two military dictatorships. Stroessner, the Paraguay dictator, and Médici, the Brazilian dictator. Under the Médici government, a lot of people were tortured, killed, and disappeared. And this dam, this is a very important issue. When a dam is constructed in a country like Brazil, I'm not talking a country like Germany that now has a compromise with renewable energies. Brazil, India, even US, they still use polluting energies elements. What is the idea that we receive from these governments? We are going into the development. We are becoming a developed country. But this is an idea that makes natural or invisible the suffering and the extermination of these groups. When Itaipu was constructed in 1973, and nowadays the Brazilians go to Itaipu and take photographs, take images as a remembrance. But when it was constructed under a $16 billion value and expenses, 1,300 kilometers were of area between Brazil and Paraguay was floated. We used to have a very beautiful waterfall like Niagara, for example. Seven Falls was the name. It disappeared. There was no a good environmental study, and we lost 32 different indigenous lands of the Ava Guarani traditional lands. They call these traditional lands tecorras. Tecorra is a traditional land of the Ava Guarani nation. In São Paulo, where I live, we have a community of Ava Guaranis, are very poor. They are under misery because when their lands are stolen, they do not have as to keep their economy, their traditional economy, not a capitalist model of economy. And this image here, these two images, I choose two between others, show the workers of the Itaipu Dam Company and from a governmental structure together. They went to the Guarani's lands, expelled them by gunmed men, and then they put fire in the Guarani's houses, in the Guarani's homes, buildings. You can see here the symbol of the company in the truck, the white truck here, and behind it, the firing. We call in Brazil the house of the indigenous ocas or malocas. These ocas were firing after a great violence. One of the military responsibles, General José Costa Cavalcante, he was the first general director of the Itaipu Binational. He used to say, the animals for the refuge, the Indians for Paraguay. So I do not understand how there are people that do not understand there's a genocide in Brazil.
Professor Flávio, we have Professor Joyce Apsel with her hand up with a question. Is it okay that I?
Yeah. Oh, yes, okay.
Just grant her access. Professor Apsel, can you hear us? You might have to unmute your microphone.
Yes, I did. Thank you. Flavio, it's wonderful to see you.
I'm missing you a lot, Professor Apsel. How are you?
I'm wonderful. When you have time, can you talk to the question of, is this colonial settler? The amount of people who actually settled from Europe, or did they use a divide and rule as part of what they were doing? And finally, the ideology of destruction.
Okay, I can talk about that. Professor Apsel, I will include this comment inside what I have to talk now, because I'm finishing, and then we can develop this idea. A very good question, indeed. Thank you, Professor Apsal. Well, in 1967, we had a report in 1967 produced by the military government itself. It's named Figueiredo Report. Figueiredo, Jader Figueiredo, was a kind of public lawyer, a procurator, we can say. And he was responsible to travel all over Brazil and to register what was happening to the Brazilian indigenous nations. And then, after 16,000 kilometers of expedition, he published this report in a press collective event. And then he published that the extermination of the indigenous nations in Brazil was a reality. Mass murder of the members of many different nations, communities, torture, cruelties, sexual violence. And in this report from 1967, says that the practice of the most varied cruelties against Indians throughout the national territory, both by landowners and by officials of the Indigenous Protection Service, SPI, demonstrates the existence of a genocidal state. Due to this, you have here the link to read this report. Unfortunately, it's in Portuguese, but we can eventually traduce it. And due to this report, the Sunday Times from 1969 published this this front page news about the Brazilian genocide. And in that time, one of the officials of the Brazilian military government used to say, "We think that the ideas of preserving the indigenous population within their natural habitat are very beautiful ideas, but they are not realistic. The idea was the assimilation. Assimilation, as the thinking of Raphael Lemkin, is ethnocide, genocide." Belo Monte Dam, as we are talking about what happened and its legacy to the present time, I could tell you another example from nowadays. A few years ago, Belo Monte Dam was constructed, even facing the conviction of the Brazilian state before the Inter-American Court Commission of Human Rights. 80%, only for you to have an idea of this environmental and genocidal impact, 80% of the important river that we call Xingu River has been diverted, 80%. The river became dry in this region. Between the channel and the reservoir, 516 quadrat meters of land was flooded, an area bigger than Chicago City. Of this area, 400 kilometers were native forest, native. And I'm not talking about Bolsonaro's government. I'm talking about Dilma's government that was much better to the indigenous nation than Bolsonaro. There was a violation of the right to previous consultation and free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous communities. I'm talking about the Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization, a mandatory international convention. Brazil simply ignored it. So I'm going to talk about Bolsonaro's government. Since 2019 until now, we have elections here in 2022. Probably the defeat of Trump was a very good news for those who do not like the current government. But the ethnocide, the genocide, became almost a declared purpose. I show you here a new from the New York Times from August 2019. A mention by Bolsonaro. The North American cavalry were the competent ones because they decimated their indigenous people in the past. And today, they don't have this problem in their country. Can you imagine a chief of state declaring it? Well, it's in the New York Times. You have the link here to consult. But I have other visions. From January 23rd, from this year, 2020, the Indians are evolving more and more. They are human beings like us. This is a kind of thinking, a kind of vision that you could, we could input to Adolf Hitler's phrase. This is a very serious thinking about indigenous nations. You can, after read with more time, the other declarations, but they are mainly relating to an idea that a kind of, in my government, there want to be an link of indigenous lands demarcated to them. Well, we have some measures proposed by the Brazilian government. Proposal for Constitution Amendment 215. Who are competent in Brazil, who have competence in Brazil to demarcate the indigenous lands? The executive power, the presidency, the president. They try to change this competence to our Congress, to our parliament. But our parliament is totally dominated by the farmers, by the multinationals interested in our indigenous lands. For you to have an idea, Brazil was discovered by the Portuguese in 1500. We have now, in 2018, the first indigenous women elected in Brazil. We do not have a fair representation in our Congress. That's why, if I change this competence, we will have never more a demarcated land, indigenous lands in Brazil. What is the demarcation of these lands? The Brazil's state recognize that inside a certain area, nobody can explore this land. It's an indigenous land. Well, we have another very important discussion, because the first one, about the amendment, now is freeze it, I could say. But we have now the timeline thesis. What is the timeline thesis? Our Brazilian constitution, the democratic one, was promulgated in October 5th, 1988. This is the birth of our democratic period with our new constitution. 35 years now. Suddenly, someone created a thesis, an idea. The indigenous nations will have recognized their right to their lands if they prove that on October 5th, 1988, they were occupying effectively these lands. But how can this idea be serious if since 1500 they have been stolen from their lands? This is not a serious idea, but now in November, our Brazilian Supreme Court will decide in a case promoted against the Xoklengs Nation. Xoklengs Nation is a nation from the south of Brazil, of the state of Santa Catarina. And a farmer, an organization, are trying to have their lands. if our Supreme Court decides that the timeline thesis must prevail, it's the end of the future of our indigenous nations. On the other hand, you have the indigenous, we call indigenato, indigenous position that recognize the aspect of the traditionality of these lands. And I hope this will be the victorious position. The judgment will happen now in November, must happen now in November. Another action of the current government, the emptying of the budgets of the administrative and public structures that should protect our indigenous nations according to our constitution. FUNAI, I could translate to National Indigenous Foundation, lost their budget, and some anti-indigenous men were designated to direct the actions of this. What must be a protective structure for the indigenous is nowadays unopposed to their rights. The NGOs in Brazil are being persecuted. They had also achieved by this budget elimination, for example. And now there's a new proposal for law 2633 from this year that must guarantee the amnesty for those invaders of the Union's lands. By the Article 231 of the Brazilian Constitution, the indigenous lands are lands of the Union. If I give amnesty to someone that invaded the Union's lands, probably the indigenous lands, part of them at least, are targeted in this proposal if it will be approved. We are fighting against this absurd. Well, and then I got to my conclusion. What is genocide? What is ethnocide? We must remember that after the Second World War, when in 1948, thanks to Raphael Lemkin, we had the approval of a UN convention. It was a very important step for humanity. But in my personal vision, it suffers of a lack of efficiency, of efficacy. It's not, it all works. It does not work. Why it doesn't work? Because we have to prove the intention, for sure. If you have a legal, criminal, technical perspective, we have to prove the intention, for sure. But genocide, in my view, is not an idea restricted to a criminal technical perception. And this was the idea of Raphael Lemkin. I have a vision of Raphael Lemkin here. Genocide for him is the destruction of the essential basis of the life of a certain group. Destruction of the essential basis. Then I give an example. We have in Brazil an epidemic, it's considered epidemic or epidemic, forgive my English, because we have a large number of suicides from indigenous boys and girls from 10 years old, 11 years old, because they are between two different worlds. And this is a very serious problem. When they lost their lands, they become miserable people in the big cities, suffering with the racism of the population, of the majority. they lost their references and they commit suicide. We have a high number of suicides of indigenous boys and girls in Brazil. And now, I don't know exactly why, the number of girls are becoming higher. And Raphael Lemkin says, the destruction of essential base of the life of a certain group seeking its extinction. And now he writes, we can interpret and reflect on the possibility extinction of a given group by eliminating other references pertaining to such a victimized group, such as, for example, its culture. That's why the Nazis forbidden the Polish culture during the occupation. Poland do not exist so far. It's forbidden the university for Polish. It's forbidden the theater for Polish. The way of life, their beliefs. Oh, they have to become Christian as we are, or Muslim as we are, or Buddhist as we are. I remember now Myanmar, for example. The way of its beliefs, the disintegration of its political and social structure and institutions, languages. For example, our Brazilian constitution, our current Brazilian constitution, guarantees the education in Portuguese and also in their mother tongue. But it's not a reality in Brazil. I could say also about the health system. We have a specific health system for indigenous nations in Brazil, but it's not observed by the government, and even so by the other governments. That's why COVID is killing more indigenous individuals than non-indigenous. Because you could say, well, they do not have the immunological memory. They were exterminated by diseases. But even we do not have this immunological memory. Why they are the main victims in Brazil? Because they do not have, they have been deprived for the last centuries from a good health system. And Raphael Lemkin also says, from this perspective, the question is, in the case of indigenous peoples, do their traditional lands constitute a fundamental basis for their existence? Yes. All these problems, they could be more, they could be eliminated if the indigenous lands were really, really secure, preserved. I should say to you that Raphael Lemkin wrote his ideas in his famous book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, published in 1944. I remember Professor Apsel and we talked a lot about his book in 2014 in Toronto. And, but some recent discoveries of Raphael Lemkin's writings shows that he had the intention to write a collection of analyses. One of these books should be about the indigenous of South America, because we had a genocide in Argentina, in Chile. For example, in Chile, the Mapuches, Mapu means land, Mapuches, those that are from the lands, Some 4 Mapuches were convicted in Chile by terrorism because they were in a parade against the government and put fire in a house, an empty house from the government. Well, they were accused of terrorism, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights convicted the Chile state against this. No, it was a violation of liberty of speech against a policy that is against the Chileans indigenous. It happens in Brazil. It happens in Argentina now. Argentina is better, but Argentina exterminated their indigenous lands, nations too. And I should mention to you, I like him a lot, Martin Shaw. Martin Shaw, a British researcher, he wrote in his book, What is Genocide? The idea of a sociological perception of genocide. And he says, Lemkin was looking for a term and the law that brought together a whole class of violent and humiliating actions against members of collectivities. Genocide was not a specific type of violence. Lemkin considered it to include not only organized violence, but also economic destruction and persecution. This is very important because when the state stole indigenous land, the state kills their economy, their way of life, and the way of life that preserves the environment, because they know where they need to cultivate, when they need to change the area. They have very ancient medicine knowledge. And Martin Shaw says, what concerned him, Lemkin, was precisely the common threat of these types of actions. Its threat to the existence of a collectivity and therefore to the social order itself. We are talking about a broader scenario of killing instruments. And then I must ask to you, for sure that we have a criminal concept. You must remember that Raphael Lemkin was working on an idea of genocide much before the Second World War. When the Second World War started and Winston Churchill declared at the BBC transmission, there's a crime without name happening in Europe. So the worry was, we must have an international criminal, an international crime for this situation. And then genocide became restricted to this idea, but it's not in its origin. And then Raphael Lemkin says, the essence of genocide rests in the attempt to destroy a nation or an ethnic group by different means. In his book, he writes biological means, economic means, cultural means. Raphael Lemkin himself wrote ethnocide. And finally, to conclude my presentation, I come back to Martin Shaw. We need to move, I propose, toward the main stage of sociological conceptualization, the formation of structural concept. That's what our National Truth Commission wrote about indigenous. We have a structural genocide in Brazil. This means moving away from the subjective meaning of genocide direction, moving away of the intention. That's what he wants to say. Towards the understanding of typical social relations of genocide, social relations of genocide. All the societies, they invent and reinvent themselves day by day. If you are a suddenly rupture come to them, as for example, the stolen of their lands, that's genocide, because you make impossible the continuity of that culture. And for sure that I change a lot of ideas with Professor Silva Steiner, for my proud, the first Brazilian judge in the ICC, and she has a very clear idea of genocide in an international criminal way. And she's right, totally right. I agree with her. But you have to change the perception of what is genocide. So we have this kind of phenomenon in Brazil. I didn't mention to you, but we had a genocide in Brazil recognized by the Brazilian Supreme Court in 1993 against the Yanomamis, the Hashimu genocide. I can send to you material about that. And all these challenges we have now in Brazil to protect our indigenous nations. I would like to thank you, Megan, to Jenna, to Professor Apso. Please, if you could repeat the question of Professor Apso, I can answer now, and of other questions we eventually can have. Thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you so much for that very engaging presentation. We do have quite a bit of questions already. I wonder if I unmute Professor Apsel, maybe she can repeat the question she asked initially. Is that okay? Okay, perfect.
Thank you for that presentation. My question was about seeing genocide by attrition was one of the terms that I think you're describing, and that is an ongoing pattern against indigenous peoples worldwide. And do you think that that is going on in Brazil?
Yes, yes. I agree with this idea. We have it in Brazil. I could say we have in Brazil two kinds of actions. The genocidal direct actions, for example, the Cinta Larga massacre, for example, this is very clear. The communities were bombed. They received poisonous sugar, poisonous toys for the children. This is a direct action of genocide. And I must remember that even for those who defends the technical vision of genocide, we do not need only a state, a public structure committing genocide. Private organizations and farmers and land miners, illegal loggers, they can commit genocide. This was the case of Hashimu genocide I've just mentioned to you. But on the other hand, we have some dynamics that are not a directly genocide. For example, as the criminal expert Alicia Gil from Spain used to write and to say, if I decide to build a dam and in the area that must be flooded, we have 2 or 3 different indigenous nations. If they do not want to leave their lands, where they have their sacred cemeteries, their sacred areas for religious practices, I used to say, well, if they do not want to leave the area, they have to support the consequences. And I build the dam. Is it not a genocide? Is it not a genocide? If we have the Convention 169 of the ILO, International Labour Organization, obliging the previous consultation to the indigenous nations, if our constitution, now Article 231 also guarantees it, if I build this dam, if I put fire in their homes, what is the difference? Because this is a kind of, we used to say, we have an expression in Brazil, probably abroad too, a kind of environmental racism. I put fire in their homes, in their plantations, in their cultures, and they have to flee to the cities, to other areas, and they become miserable people. They lost their culture. They become miserable. Is it not an ethnocide? Because I provoke the disappearance of these cultures. That's why we need a sociological view for genocide. I must emphasize, it does not exist. as Professor Silverstein used to say, the idea of ecocide that was recently a discussion, a hot topic in Brazil, is not legal possibly because we do not have the crime of ecocide, for sure. But we need to change our view, I think. So I agree with you, Professor Epsel, about your this conception of genocide and how it is really happening in Brazil.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Okay, we have some other questions here. I'll read them out and we'll go from there. So we do have one here. They say, I would be extremely interested to hear your perspective on this point on the impact of transboundary water agreements on Indigenous populations. How, apart from taking issues rising from such agreement to the ICJ, can Indigenous rights be upheld and balanced against a nation's water rights, especially as these relate to the immense difficulty of water governance and these terrible impacts that are inequitable water sharing agreement can have on minorities of the country?
Well, if I understood the question, it concerns the possibility of an action before the ICC, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, nowadays in Brazil, we have had 2 or 3 claims proposed before the ICC against our current president. I personally think that we will not have a kind of sequence in these claims. It's very difficult. Why? Because we have a very clear international criminal law standard. But in relation to the indigenous, if we show clearly not the direct intention, but if we agree as internationalists that we have the risk of their extermination with a governmental action, and I assume this risk, we should have a kind of genocide here. But it's not what prevails in the world. When I was talking again to Professor Silversteiner, we're talking about a decision of the judge, of the Brazilian judge at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in The Hague.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a dissenting vote when he wrote that for genocide, to understand for the happening of a genocide, we must not consider the specific intention, the mens rea, the dolus. We must have the possibility to understand that we have the genocide coming from the circumstances of the fact. For example, if I send gunmen to an indigenous community to take them off of there, to build a dam, and I kill some of them, I beat some of them, I oblige them to go to other states by airplanes, as it happened in the Brazilian dictatorship, and I put fire in their homes. I ask you, what is, please, with the needed proportions, okay? But what is the dynamic of the Old West in US, in the Nazi East during the Second World War and the Holocaust? And what I am describing now, we take that people that lived there for centuries, as it happened with the Armenians also, we know it. Armenians were victims of this kind of dynamics. And we take them off there. We colonize their lands. We explore the soil richness. Remember the extreme far right slogan, soil and blood.
Mm.
And Professor, he has a very good book, Soil and Blood, about genocide. I forgot his name, a very important scholarship, genocide scholar. And then, if I have this dynamic, why it's not genocide with the indigenous Brazilian peoples, right? That's why I think we must change this idea. I like this position of Professor of the judge Cansado Trindade, the Brazilian judge of the ICJ. But as Professor Silvio Steiner says, he's an internationalist, not an international criminalist.
Right.
But I confess to you and to my dear friend Silvio Steiner that I agree with his vision. Because we need to consider not on the intention that is inside the mind of the perpetrator. Why does the perpetrator must have the power, the decision to define it? No, the dynamics between the perpetrator and the victim, the dynamics existent between the victims themselves, and the structure established by the state that day by day conduct these people to the miserability, to the end of their culture. This must be considered for us to have a new genocide theory. Not a new, a Lemkian genocide theory.
And have there been any progressive governments in the past several years in Brazil who have advocated for indigenous rights, or has it been mostly grassroots movements?
Well, the indigenous nations in Brazil have faced, since the Europeans got to Brazil, a very difficult situation. But we have governments that are open to dialogue.
Okay.
And inside a kind of civilization sphere. Nowadays, in my personal opinion, we are out a civilizational sphere. But they have been facing always, since then, since the Portuguese got here, a very difficult situation.
Okay, so we have another one here. The right to physically occupy traditional lands is indeed essential, but what is happening now is brutal effects of climate change gradually making even demarcated lands far less habitable than they were even a generation ago. The Brazilian filmmaker Mai Pereira has documented in his film, Where Did the Swallows Go? And they sent a link. Do you know anything about how climate change has impacted indigenous communities?
Yes. The most preserved, you can find this data if you look for it. The most preserved forests in Brazil, forest areas in Brazil, are the indigenous forests, because they learn. Let me explain a very important point. This is a very good question. When the man got to the Americas 40,000 years ago by Canada, and we have now, as a result of the Brazilian archaeologist research, Nied Guidon, she found carbon-14 proofs of the presence of the man here in Brazil territory for 40,000 years ago. Well, was a very wonderful discovery. Well, they are very old nations, civilizations. We need to stop thinking about only under a European, Eurocentric vision. We have old nations in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas. So, since then, they learned how to cohabit with the forests. They do not have their lands. They are the lands. They are the lands. I'll give an example that comes from New Zealand. 2 years ago, the New Zealand government approved the recognition the recognition of a legal personality to the sacred river of the Maoris, the Wanganui River. You can find this document at the internet. You can watch this session at the New Zealand Parliament with the Maoris nation. What does it mean? It means that if someone touched that river, the river itself goes to the court, represented by two lawyers, a Maori lawyer and a state lawyer. What does it mean? Also, that they observed an indigenous cosmological view and inserted it in this dominant society structure. It was a kind of inversion of the way. We usually try to assimilate, right? New Zealand did the contrary. They brought an indigenous cosmology vision to a state policy. This was wonderful. In Brazil, we have the same. They know how to preserve, how to extract their food, how to hunt, how to practice their sacred acts without destroying. I didn't show to you, but we have now in Brazil a new drama. The dams, they are how can I say? They are old. They are not conserved, and some of them are falling down, and the rejects are invading the cities. I have an image, a kind of tsunami. I prefer not to show to you here. That killed the Green River. The Green River, Rio Verde in Portuguese, is a sacred river for the Krenak nation. It's dead. It's dead. So there's a close connection between the preservation of the ecosystem, and I use a concept, a larger concept, not only the flora, the fauna, the animals, but also the cultural references. This is environmental, by ecosystem, biomes, but also their cultural references. As an Armenian church, as a synagogue, for example. And then they know how to preserve because they live in the Americas for many, a long time.
Right.
To destroy the indigenous culture means to destroy the environmental. That's why, yes, I'm curious about Joe Biden's new policy in relation to Brazil. I'm really curious.
And Ryan asks a few questions as well. He asks, would you consider Xingu National Park to be part of a forced removal process? That's his first question.
I don't think it will happen, because Xingu National Park is a kind of, it's a very important symbol to Brazil. When you talk about Xingu National Park, you talk about the result of a wonderful project initiated by Vilas Boas brothers. They were even indicated to the International Nobel Peace Nobel, or the Peace Nobel Prize.
Nobel Peace Prize, yeah.
Yeah, but they did not get it. But anyway, the only fact to be indicated is a victory. And this is a very important indigenous reference to Brazil. I don't think it must happen. But what is happening is the consequence of the building of the Belo Monte Dam. Belo Monte Dam caused a very hard and destructive impact on Xingu National Park. And it's still, these consequences they are not totally known yet. It was a very sad moment, and it didn't happen under Bolsonaro. It happened in other governments.
He also asks, does the Krenak, is that how you pronounce it, the Krenak Agricultural Reformatory work as an institution of forced assimilation?
Well, the reformatory Krenak was a prison. In Brazil, we have a situation that looks like a little with a Canada situation. In Canada, we have the mountain police, right? They are military.
Yeah.
They are not civil. They are military. Okay. We had Andrew that studied with me at Zorian some years ago. He was he is, I think, a military from the mountain police. In Brazil, we have the civil police that make the investigation of the crimes, and another police, the military police, under a military regime. For you to have an idea, in São Paulo, only the state I live, we have more than 1,030 policemen here. It's an army.
Wow.
And they are an auxiliary force of the armed forces in Brazil. And during the dictatorship, the military police of the state of Minas Gerais, each state of the federation, Brazil is a federation like Canada, has its military police. The state of Minas Gerais military police built this prison inside Krenak land. And all the indigenous from Brazil that were considered against the regime was taken to this prison. You have the ruins of this prison. And we also have a documentary at YouTube, but it's in Portuguese. Anyway, we can try to translate it too. And this prison was a center of torture, disappearance, violations, not only physical violations, but cultural violations also. And today we are trying to convert these ruins in a memorial. But why the dictatorship in Brazil murdered more than 80,300 indigenous individuals? Those that we could prove. We probably will never know how many of them were killed. But why? They were not members of left armed gunnet organizations. Why they were killed? Because they are considered until today obstacles to the developmentism. This is the issue that Shelton Davis, I showed his book to you, some mentions that Shelton Davis used to write. And it exists until today. Bolsonaro wants to give access to the indigenous lands, to the mining companies, to the loggers. If it happens, it's the end of these nations. It's the end of these cultures.
Yeah.
It cannot occur.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Did the Brazilian government adopt a blood quantum as a legal designation of ethnic identity?
You mean a policy for this? Is that the
blood quantum? It's in quotation marks. Let me see here, Ryan. I don't know if you can read.
Affirmative action. You mean an affirmative action?
Let me see. Ryan, I don't know if you could raise your hand and I can unmute you. Maybe you can explain what that is. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. Hi, Ryan. Can you hear us?
Hi, Ryan. How are you?
You just have to unmute your mic.
Okay, I think you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear.
trying to draw parallels with the United States, a history I'm more familiar with. And, you know, the blood quantum determined sort of whether or not you're considered to be ethnically indigenous or not. And I know with a society like Brazil, with a lot of mixture, if there is, and you're right on the right track, Professor, with regards to affirmative action or other reasons for designation, if Brazil recognizes, how Brazil recognizes indigenous identity or African identity, European identity, etc.
Okay, great question, Ryan. Thank you for it. In Brazil, the criteria for identification is the self-identification. I recognize myself as Black people, as indigenous person. We declare it. For sure, in some specific cases, we had some problems with it. But the criteria is that in Brazil, we have 0.4% of the population as indigenous, 52% as Black people, 48% as white people. But you do not have, now it's a little better due to the affirmative actions. I'll talk about it that you asked me. But now it's a little better, but you do not have Black people in the majority of the universities. You do not have indigenous people in the universities. You do not have Black women in the main positions in the companies. Just to give an example. This is a very serious problem in Brazil because we have a kind of standard, of framework, a social and economical framework that benefits the white man. Okay. Due to this, some years ago, during the Lula government, the affirmative actions, just like in US, we studied a lot here, the US Supreme Court cases, Plessy versus Ferguson, for example, the Jim Crow laws. We have some difference, but we have some experience that we can change. And due to this action, in the last years, I am a 25 years. I am a professor for 25 years. Now I remember, and now I can see that I'm having more Black students. Indigenous, very, very difficult. Because the universities, a school of law, for example, that I visited in the state of Paraná, in the south of Brazil, they have a very good reservation for indigenous. But when the indigenous students goes to the university, sometime after, they leave the school. Why? Because the teaching structure do not consider their realities. And sometimes they feel themselves as discriminated, they suffer racism, and so on. But we have these actions in Brazil. It caused some improvements. But now, under this kind of Trump's phase, Trump's period, and Bolsonaro's period, the speech, the expressive speech against this kind of social inclusion became more and more clear, especially in the internet. We must study the impact of technology in this kind of situation. The internet, as Humberto Eco said, gave us a lot of space and resources, but also turned an idiot as a thinker, a great thinker in the internet. But even so, I know that in US, we have one or two claims against some universities to end the affirmative actions. In Brazil, we have this kind of position too. But I think the majority of the Brazilian population understand that this is very important. I should give you another statistic. We have in Brazil 800,000 imprisoned people. 70 or 80% of these people are Black. But why are they not at the universities?
Right.
This is the colonial thinking that still exists. We defeated the Nazi fascism in Europe, but we did not defeat the colonialism thinking, way of thinking. We must do it.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I have answered your question, Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Professor Flávio, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation today. We really appreciate you joining us. And thank you to all the participants of this webinar as well. If you have any questions, feel free to send us an email or Professor Flávio an email. We'll also have the recording available for you as of tomorrow. So if you missed any part of the presentation or want to share it with a friend, you will receive the link, or you can visit our website to learn more as well. And please join us next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Same time. We'll be discussing immigrant rights in the United States with Tanya Golash-Boza. And finally, on a final note, if you want to learn more about the Institute's Genocide and Human Rights University program, we're hoping it will be held in 2021 if it's safe for everyone to come travel here to Canada. So keep checking in on our website for updates. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to send us an email. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Professor Apsel. Great professor for me. Thank you, George, and all my friends and alumni at Torian Institute, and to our colleagues that were with us here. If you need the material, I can send you, Megan, by PDF, and you can send to our friends here.
I'd be happy to. Great.
See you next week.
See you next week. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.